The helicopter descended through September clouds, and I caught my first glimpse of the Thoroughfare Ranger Station, a solitary brown structure dwarfed by the immensity of Yellowstone's southeast wilderness. From the air, it looked like a child's toy dropped carelessly into an ocean of lodgepole pine, a single human mark on terrain that had resisted human presence for millennia. My name is Allison Porter. I'm 29 years old, and I requested this posting specifically because it was the most isolated assignment the National Park Service could offer. The reasons for that request are my own, though I suspect they're documented somewhere in my personnel file. Mass casualty incident, Denver, March 14th. I was the senior EMT on scene. I made decisions that saved lives and decisions that ended them. Triage is just a clinical word for playing God with a stopwatch. 6 months of mandatory counseling hadn't helped. Neither had the medication, the support groups, or the well-meaning friends who kept telling me I'd done my best. What I needed was silence, distance, an absence of people and their fragile, bleeding bodies. The Park Service, perhaps recognizing desperation when they saw it, granted my request without question. Thoroughfare Station sits 30 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by horseback or helicopter, deep in what's considered the most remote location in the lower 48 states. The Yellowstone River cuts through the valley, and grizzly bears outnumber humans by a ratio I preferred not to calculate. My assignment was simple: winter caretaker for a station that normally operated only during summer months. 6 months of solitude, basic maintenance, wildlife monitoring, and ensuring the cabin survived until spring. It sounded like exactly what I needed. District Ranger Tom Whitlock met me at the station for a 30-minute orientation before the helicopter departed. He was in his 50s, weathered in the way of men who'd spent decades in the backcountry with eyes that didn't quite meet mine when he spoke. "Radio check every morning at 0800, he said, moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency. "Emergency channel stays monitored 24/7. Supply drop by helicopter first week of each month, weather permitting. Medical evac takes minimum 4 hours in good conditions, longer if there's weather." He showed me the basics: the propane heating system, the solar panels and battery backup, the satellite internet terminal with its frustratingly slow connection. The cabin itself was Spartan but well-maintained, one main room serving as kitchen and living area, a small bedroom, a storage room, and an attached shed for equipment. Built in 1903, according to a plaque by the door, the structure had been renovated multiple times but retained the bones of its original construction. "You'll be fine," Whitlock said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Most winters are quiet. Keep busy, follow protocols, and the time passes faster than you'd think." He handed me a laminated card with emergency contact numbers, then paused at the door. "I sent you the station protocols last week. Please tell me you read them." I had a vague memory of an email with an attachment, opened during my frantic preparation period and promptly forgotten among the dozens of other administrative documents. "Of course," I lied. Whitlock studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. They're important. More important than people think." He stepped outside, then turned back. "All of them, Porter. Not just the ones that make sense." The helicopter lifted off 10 minutes later, and I watched it disappear beyond the ridgeline, taking with it the last connection to the world I knew. The silence that settled over the valley wasn't peaceful. It was profound, almost physical, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat and breathing. I spent the afternoon unpacking and settling in. As the sun dropped toward the western peaks, casting long shadows through the pines, I remembered Whitlock's comment about protocols. I opened my laptop, the satellite connection glacially slow, and searched through my email until I found the message. The attachment was titled, Thoroughfare Station Protocols, Mandatory Compliance. I opened it expecting the standard wilderness safety guidelines, bear protocols, fire prevention, water purification procedures. The document did contain those things formatted as a numbered list, but interspersed among the reasonable regulations were rules that made me pause, made me read them twice to ensure I wasn't misunderstanding. Rule number 4, never investigate animal sounds that mimic human speech. Radio for morning support if you believe you've heard such sounds. Rule number 6, never investigate sounds of distress after sunset. Radio for morning support. Rule number 9, if you see a ranger in a vintage uniform, pre-1950s style, do not engage in conversation. Return to the cabin immediately. Rule number 13, after the first snowfall, do not answer the door after dark. Verify all visitors by radio before opening the door. Rule number 17, if you feel you are being watched while outside the cabin, return immediately. Do not look behind you. I read through all 17 rules, my initial confusion giving way to something close to amusement. These had to be hazing rituals, ghost stories passed down through generations of rangers stationed in isolation. Yellowstone had a long history of rangers going slightly mad in remote postings. The Park Service archives were full of incident reports that politely described psychological episodes and stress-related behaviors. Someone, probably decades ago, had codified their paranoia into official-looking protocols, and the tradition had persisted out of bureaucratic inertia or dark humor. I closed the document without saving it. My EMT training had taught me to assess situations rationally, to separate real threats from perceived ones. Out here, the real dangers were hypothermia, wildlife encounters, and accidents that could prove fatal in the time it took for rescue to arrive. Those were the threats I'd prepare for. The rest was just wilderness folklore, and I'd spent enough of my life being afraid. As darkness fell over Thoroughfare Station, I made dinner, wrote my first log entry, and went to bed feeling more at peace than I had in months. Outside, the forest settled into night sounds, wind through pine branches, the distant calls of elk, the ever-present whisper of the river. I fell asleep easily, dreamlessly, completely unaware that my rational certainty would last exactly 14 more days. The first 2 weeks of my assignment passed in a rhythm that felt almost meditative. I woke at dawn, performed radio check with Whitlock, then spent my days on patrol, hiking established trails, documenting wildlife activity, maintaining the backcountry campsites within my jurisdiction. The work was physically demanding but mentally restful, requiring attention without emotional weight. The solitude I'd craved settled over me like a blanket. Hours would pass without me speaking aloud except to myself or the occasional curious raven. The landscape revealed itself gradually, thermal features steaming in the cold morning air, a wolf pack's tracks along the river, the massive excavations where grizzlies had torn apart logs searching for grubs before denning. I was healing, I thought. The distance was working. On my 15th night, the temperature dropped sharply, the first real cold snap of autumn. I'd spent the evening by the cabin's wood stove reading and listening to downloaded podcasts, the kind of peaceful solitude I'd imagined when I requested this posting. I went to bed around 10, tired from a long patrol, and fell asleep almost immediately. The crying woke me just after midnight. A child sobbing with the kind of desperate, hitching breaths that indicate genuine distress. The sound was clear even through the cabin's walls, coming from somewhere in the forest to the east. I was out of bed before I was fully conscious, my EMT training overriding everything else. Child in distress, potentially lost hiker, hypothermia risk in these temperatures, minutes matter, seconds matter. I had my boots half laced when my hand touched the door handle and something made me stop. The crying continued, but now that I was fully awake, something about it disturbed me. The rhythm was too regular, too consistent. Real crying fluctuates, builds and ebbs, punctuated by gasps and pauses. This was mechanical in its steadiness, like a recording set on loop. I moved to the window instead, peering out into darkness broken only by starlight. The crying continued, neither approaching nor receding. I grabbed my night vision binoculars from the equipment locker and scanned the tree line. At first I saw nothing but the green-tinted shapes of trees and underbrush, then movement at the forest edge, perhaps 60 yards from the cabin. A small figure, child-sized, standing completely motionless at the boundary between meadow and forest. The crying sound was coming from it, but the figure itself didn't move, not its shoulders with breath, not its head with emotion. It simply stood, and the crying emanated from it like an audio speaker playing a recording. My hands started shaking, making the binoculars waver. I set them down and grabbed my high-powered flashlight, the kind we used for wildlife deterrence, capable of throwing a beam 300 yards. I pointed it through the window and switched it on. The beam caught the figure fully, and in that moment of illumination, several things became clear. It was roughly the size and shape of a child, but its proportions were subtly wrong. Limbs slightly too long, head slightly too large. Its skin had a pale, waxy quality that reflected light like latex. And most disturbing, when the beam hit it, the crying stopped instantly. Not trailing off, not interrupted, stopped as if a switch had been flipped. The figure's head turned toward the cabin, toward the window, toward me. Then it began walking backward into the forest. Not turning around and walking away, walking backward, its gait smooth and fluid, its joints bending in ways that human knees don't bend. It maintained eye contact with me the entire time, its face expressionless, until the darkness between the trees swallowed it. I stood at the window for 3 hours, flashlight in hand, watching the forest. The crying didn't resume. Nothing emerged from the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, just beyond the range of vision, waiting. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold, I made coffee with hands that still trembled. Then I did something I'd told myself I wouldn't do. I retrieved the protocol's document from my deleted emails and read through it again. Rule number 6. Never investigate sounds of distress after sunset. Radio for morning support if you believe you've heard such sounds. The words no longer seemed like folklore. I grabbed my pack and went outside, needing to confirm what I'd seen, hoping the daylight would reveal some rational explanation. The ground was frost-hard, but near the tree line where the figure had stood, I found impressions in the thin layer of frost-killed grass. They looked like tracks, not quite footprints. The impressions were narrow, pointed, as if something had walked on limbs that ended in stakes rather than feet. Whatever made them had walked upright, bipedal, but the gait was wrong, the stride length inconsistent with human locomotion. I followed the tracks into the forest, my radio in hand, my bear spray unholstered. 20 yards in, the tracks began circling, spiraling outward from where they'd entered the trees. I followed the spiral until I realized it was leading me back toward the cabin, but from a different angle. The tracks circled the cabin. I counted 7 complete circuits around the structure, always maintaining the same distance, about 40 feet from the walls. The tracks showed no hesitation, no pauses, just steady, methodical circling. At the north side of the cabin, where the ground sloped down toward the river, the tracks simply ended at the water's edge. No marks where something had entered the water. No continuation on the opposite bank. Just ended. I stood there for a long time, staring at those impossible tracks, and felt the certainty of my worldview beginning to crack. I'd spent 6 months trying to escape the trauma of watching people die, believing that distance and isolation would provide clarity. Instead, I'd isolated myself with something I couldn't explain, couldn't rationalize, couldn't categorize within any framework I understood. That night, I moved a chair to the window and sat watch until dawn. The protocols document open on my laptop, reading and rereading rules I'd dismissed as superstition. I didn't hear the crying again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing in the forest was still there, beyond the tree line, learning my patterns, testing my responses, waiting for the next opportunity to call me outside. October arrived with temperature swings that painted the valley in frost each morning only to melt away by afternoon. The aspen groves turned gold, then shed their leaves in a single week, leaving skeletal white branches against evergreen slopes. I'd fallen into a state of hypervigilance, conducting my patrols with constant wariness, returning to the cabin before sunset regardless of where I was or what work remained. The crying incident had changed something fundamental. I now monitored the forest with the kind of attention I'd previously reserved for assessing trauma patients, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything out of place. I saw things I couldn't explain, areas where the wildlife avoided without apparent reason, sections of forest where my compass needle spun without stopping, thermal features that steamed even when the ground around them was frozen solid. I reported none of this to Whitlock during our daily radio checks. How could I? I saw something that looked like a child but moved wrong, sounded like exactly the kind of psychological break that would trigger an immediate evacuation and end my career. So I kept silent and followed the rules I'd once mocked, treating them like algorithms, input conditions, prescribed output behaviors. Don't investigate sounds after dark. Don't engage with anomalous figures. Verify before opening doors. The rules became ritual, and ritual became survival. I'd been alone for 32 days when Ranger Kyle Morrison arrived. The helicopter came without warning on an overcast Tuesday, and I watched with mixed feelings as a man in his mid-20s climbed out, moving with the confident energy of someone excited to be here. Whitlock had mentioned a scheduled rotation. Experienced rangers typically did 2-week stints at remote stations, both for their safety and to break the monotony. But I'd lost track of dates. Kyle Morrison introduced himself with a firm handshake and an easy grin, the kind of person who'd probably been an athlete in college, who viewed the wilderness as a challenge to be conquered rather than a force to be respected. "First backcountry solo posting," he said, hauling his gear inside with obvious enthusiasm. "Been doing visitor services and patrol work at Old Faithful for 2 years. Finally convinced them I was ready for the real thing. I helped him settle in, showing him the cabin systems, walking him through my daily routines. He listened with the polite attention of someone who already knows most of what you're saying, nodding along but not really absorbing. When I pulled up the protocols document to review it with him, he barely glanced at it. "Yeah, Whitlock sent that to me. The ghost rules, right?" He laughed. "Every remote station has them. My buddy worked at a backcountry camp in Glacier. They had a whole list about not whistling at night and avoiding lakes under full moons. It's just folklore, stuff bored rangers made up to pass the time. Some of them are legitimate safety protocols," I said carefully. Sure. Bear safety. Don't go out alone, emergency procedures, all good stuff, but don't talk to rangers in old uniforms? Come on." He grinned at me. "You don't actually follow that stuff, do you?" I wanted to tell him about the thing in the forest, about the tracks that circled the cabin, about the feeling of being watched that had become a constant presence. Instead, I said, "I follow all the protocols. They're there for a reason." "If you say so." He moved to the window, looking out at the valley with obvious excitement. "Man, this is incredible, real wilderness. No tourists, no traffic, just us and the bears. This is what I signed up for." I envied his enthusiasm, remembering when I'd felt that same optimism. Before Denver, before the crying thing, before I understood that some places remained empty not because they were hard to reach, but because they should be avoided. The first week with Kyle was almost normal. He had an easy, confident way about him that made the cabin feel less isolated. We fell into a routine, alternating patrol days, sharing cooking duties, spending evenings playing cards or reading. He told me about growing up in Montana, about his plans to eventually become a district ranger, about his girlfriend who thought he was crazy for requesting remote postings. He didn't notice the things I noticed. The way birds went silent when we passed certain areas, the tracks that appeared overnight and led nowhere, the occasional flicker of movement at the edge of vision that vanished when you looked directly. Or if he noticed, he rationalized them away with the easy confidence of someone who'd never encountered something truly inexplicable. On his 9th night at the station, we heard something moving beneath the cabin. It was just after 8 p.m., full dark outside, both of us reading by the wood stove. The sound started as a scraping, like something large dragging itself across the ground beneath the floorboards. The cabin was built on a foundation of stacked stones, leaving a crawl space of about 3 feet between the ground and the floor joists. We both froze, books forgotten. "Bear?" Kyle whispered. I shook my head. Bears occasionally denned under structures, but it was too early in the season, and the opening to our crawl space was screened with heavy mesh specifically to prevent that. The scraping continued, methodical and purposeful, moving from one end of the cabin to the other. Then it stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. Breathing. Heavy and rhythmic, coming from directly beneath where we sat. Not animal breathing, too measured, too controlled. It sounded almost mechanical. Kyle stood up, reaching for his service weapon. "We need to check this out." "No." I grabbed his arm. "Rule 11. If something enters the crawl space, remain silent and do not investigate until it leaves." He pulled free, giving me a look that mixed concern with pity. "Allison, there's probably a rational explanation. Could be a badger, could be settling foundation, could be anything. We can't just sit here. The rule is not worth getting worked up over." He grabbed his flashlight and headed for the door. "I'll just take a quick look. Better to know what we're dealing with than sit here imagining worst-case scenarios." I followed him outside, my heart hammering, my mind screaming at both of us to stop, to wait, to follow the protocols written by people who'd survived long enough to write them down. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant overhead, the forest dark and silent around us. Kyle circled to the north side of the cabin where the crawlspace access was located, a wooden panel secured with simple latches. He crouched down, unlatching it with casual confidence, and shined his flashlight into the opening. I stood 10 feet back, every instinct screaming at me to run. "See anything?" I called. Kyle didn't respond. He'd gone completely still, his flashlight beam frozen on something I couldn't see from my angle. His posture shifted, the tension draining from his shoulders, his breathing slowing. He lowered his weapon to the ground with careful, deliberate movements. "Kyle, there's someone down here," he said, his voice strange, too calm, almost dreamy. "They're hurt. They need help. Get away from there, now." He ignored me, shifting to his hands and knees. "They're asking for me specifically. They know my name. He paused, tilting his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Yeah, I understand. Hold on, I'm coming." He began crawling into the opening. I lunged forward, grabbing his boot, trying to pull him back. "Kyle, stop. There's nothing down there that needs help." But he was stronger, motivated by whatever he was seeing or hearing, and he kicked free of my grip. I watched helplessly as he pulled himself fully into the crawl space, his flashlight beam bouncing off the support beams and foundation stones. "Kyle!" I screamed. His voice came back muffled. distant despite being only feet away. "It's okay, Allison. They just need help. They've been trapped down here for so long. I can help them. I understand now. I understand what needs to be done." I heard dragging sounds like something heavy being pulled across dirt. Kyle's flashlight beam swung wildly, then went still, pointing at nothing. His voice came again, barely audible. "I understand. Yes, I'll—" Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. I stood there in the darkness, staring at the black rectangle of the crawlspace access, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Kyle? Kyle, answer me." Nothing. I wanted to go in after him, wanted to pull him out, wanted to save him the way I'd failed to save so many in Denver. But something about the quality of that silence stopped me. A wrongness that transcended rational assessment, that spoke to a more primitive part of my brain that knew predators and traps and inescapable danger. I waited until dawn. When gray light finally seeped into the valley, I forced myself to check the crawl space. I shined my flashlight into every corner, illuminating the full space beneath the cabin. Empty. Nothing but dirt, stone, and the wooden support beams. Kyle's flashlight lay near the access panel, still on, its beam creating a useless puddle of light on the ground. His service weapon was where he'd set it down. His radio was 10 feet away, crushed flat as if something immensely heavy had stepped on it. The plastic casing shattered, the circuits exposed. I crawled out and circled the cabin, searching for any other opening large enough for a person to exit through. There was none. The crawl space was fully enclosed except for the single access point I'd just checked. Kyle Morrison had crawled into a 3-foot-high space beneath the cabin and simply ceased to exist. I radioed Whitlock at 0800, forcing my voice to remain steady as I reported that Kyle had left the cabin during the night and hadn't returned. Search and rescue arrived by helicopter 4 hours later. A team of 5 rangers who spent 2 days combing the area in expanding circles using dogs and thermal imaging and all the tools of modern search protocols. They found nothing. No tracks leading away from the cabin, no sign of struggle. No evidence Kyle Morrison had ever left the immediate vicinity. On the 3rd day, Whitlock took me aside. "What really happened, Porter?" I wanted to tell him everything, the thing in the crawl space. Kyle's strange trance, the impossibility of his disappearance. Instead, I gave him the only version that would be believed. "I don't know. We both went to bed around 10. When I woke up at 6, he was gone. His gear was still here, but he was gone." Whitlock studied me for a long moment. "You're sure you don't want to be evacuated? No shame in it." "Losing a fellow ranger—" "I'm fine," I lied. "I'll finish my assignment." He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. The search was suspended the following day. Kyle Morrison was officially listed as missing, a tragic but not unprecedented event in wilderness work. His parents would be notified. An investigation would be conducted, psychological evaluations would be required, but Kyle would never be found. Because Kyle Morrison was in the place beneath the cabin or beyond it. Or inside it. Somewhere the protocols had tried to warn him away from. Somewhere I now understood was real and patient and hungry. That night, alone again in the thoroughfare cabin, I reread every rule with desperate attention, understanding that they weren't suggestions or folklore or bureaucratic nonsense. They were a map through a minefield, and I'd just watched someone die for ignoring them. The week following Kyle's disappearance passed in a blur of official inquiries, incident reports, and a psychological evaluation conducted via satellite phone by a counselor who'd clearly been briefed to watch for signs of trauma or breakdown. I gave careful, measured responses, presenting myself as shocked but stable, concerned but rational. The truth, that I was terrified and beginning to question my own perceptions of reality, I kept locked away. Whitlock increased radio check frequency to twice daily and hinted that I could request early extraction without consequence. I declined, partly from stubbornness, partly from a growing conviction that running wouldn't help. Whatever had taken Kyle wasn't confined to this valley. The protocols existed because rangers at isolated stations across the park had encountered similar phenomena for over a century. Distance wouldn't protect me. Understanding might. I began searching the cabin systematically, looking for answers previous rangers might have left behind. The structure had housed hundreds of seasonal rangers since 1903. Surely some of them had documented what they'd experienced. But the official records contained only routine maintenance logs and wildlife observations, carefully sanitized of anything that might raise questions. It was in the storage room behind a stack of surplus equipment forms dating back to the 1970s that I found the journals. 7 of them ranging from leather-bound notebooks to modern spiral pads hidden in a metal box wrapped in canvas. The earliest was dated 1903, its pages brittle and water-stained. The most recent was from 2011. Each had been kept by a different ranger. Each documented the same impossible phenomena I was experiencing. I spread them across the table and began reading by lantern light, piecing together a history that had been systematically excluded from official records. The 1903 journal belonged to Ranger William Haskell, one of the first federal employees assigned to what would become Yellowstone's wilderness interior. His early entries documented routine observations, wildlife counts, trail conditions, weather patterns. But by his 3rd month, the tone shifted. November 18, 1903. Heard a woman calling for help from the forest after dark. Voice sounded like my sister Catherine, deceased 4 years. Did not investigate, as I know Catherine is buried in Ohio. The voice called for 3 hours, pleading with increasing desperation. I sat inside with my rifle across my lap and waited for dawn. At first light, I found tracks circling the cabin, bare feet in the snow, but no human feet are that narrow or long. The tracks led to the river and ended. Later entries grew more detailed. December 3, 1903. An old Shoshone man appeared today while I was collecting firewood. He refused to approach the cabin, remaining at the forest edge to speak with me. He said his people called this valley New Bahagant, the place between. A thin place where the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead grows permeable. His grandfather had been the last medicine man to perform the binding ceremony here, creating rules that would allow the entity to be not defeated, but negotiated with. When the army first explored this region, soldiers disappeared. When trappers came, they vanished. The Shoshone avoided this valley entirely, using it only for specific ceremonies, always following strict protocols. The old man told me the entity is ancient, predating human presence in this land. It exists in the liminal spaces, dusk and dawn, the boundary between forest and meadow, the surface of water, the space beneath structures. It feeds on isolation and loneliness, drawn to humans who are alone and desperate. It doesn't hunt with violence. It offers. It promises. It shows you what you've lost, what you miss, what you need. And if you accept its offer, you're taken to the place between, neither living nor dead, neither here nor there. He told me rules have been established, carved on stones hidden in the forest, agreed upon by something that isn't quite human and humans who learned through tragedy. Follow the rules, and you can coexist. Break them, and you give permission for it to take you. Haskell's final entry was dated February 11, 1904. I see my wife now every night. Margaret died 3 years ago of consumption, and I thought time would ease the grief. Instead, it has grown into an ache I cannot bear. She appears at the tree line wearing the dress she was buried in, calling my name with a voice I thought I'd never hear again. The rules say, never follow voices of the dead. But I'm so tired of being alone, so tired of remembering her only in fading photographs and dreams that slip away on waking. If you're reading this, I've likely joined her. Perhaps there is a place between where the dead wait for those they loved. Perhaps that's not such a terrible thing. Forgive me for my weakness. Follow the rules and you'll survive what I cannot. William Haskell's body was never recovered. Official records stated he abandoned his post and was presumed dead of exposure. The other journals told similar stories. A 1931 ranger who documented seeing figures in vintage army uniforms from the 1870s, standing at attention in the meadow, vanishing when approached. A 1967 ranger who heard his infant daughter, who had died in her crib 3 months before his assignment, crying in the forest every night for 2 weeks. A 1982 ranger who woke to find wet footprints leading from the river to his bed and back, as if something had come inside to watch him sleep. Each ranger had either disappeared or requested early extraction. Each had documented phenomena that matched what I was experiencing, and each had emphasized the same warning. The rules weren't arbitrary. They represented hard-won knowledge, a treaty negotiated through decades of loss. The most recent journal from 2011 was written by a ranger named Sarah Vance. Her entries were clinical, almost scientific, as if she'd been trying to study the phenomenon rather than simply survive it. The entity appears to be bounded by specific limitations. It cannot enter the cabin without invitation, an open door after dark, a verbal acknowledgement of its presence, a breaking of the established protocols. It manifests most strongly during periods of isolation, particularly in winter when darkness dominates. It seems to draw power from loneliness itself, as if human desperation creates a thinning of the barriers that normally separate reality from whatever realm it inhabits. The protocols aren't protection in the traditional sense. They're behavioral guidelines that prevent us from giving it permission, from acknowledging its existence in ways that grant it power over us. Don't investigate sounds. Don't respond to its lures. Don't engage with anomalous figures. Don't interact with its manifestations. Don't answer doors after dark. Don't invite it inside. The more isolated you become, the more desperate you feel, the stronger its pull. It knows exactly what you've lost, exactly what you need, exactly what lie will be most convincing. The only defense is to remain grounded in reality, to choose truth over comfort, to accept that the dead are dead and no voice in the darkness can change that. Her final entry, dated December 20th, 2011, read, "It's been showing me my son for 3 weeks now. Jordan died at age 7, cancer, 5 years ago. I've accepted his death, worked through the grief, rebuilt my life. But seeing him playing in the meadow, hearing him laugh, watching him grow into the 9-year-old he never got to be. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The entity offers me one thing I cannot have through any other means: time with my child. I'm requesting early extraction tomorrow. Not because I'm afraid of dying, because I'm afraid of accepting its offer. Afraid that part of me wants to believe the lie enough to step outside and embrace it, even knowing what it costs. To whoever comes next, you will see what you've lost. You will hear what you need. The entity is patient and it learns quickly. Your only advantage is knowing it's a lie. Hold on to that truth with everything you have. The moment you doubt, the moment you think maybe this time it's real, that's when it wins. Sarah Vance had evacuated successfully. According to personnel records I'd accessed weeks earlier, she'd requested immediate reassignment to a visitor center, accepted an administrative role, and never returned to backcountry work. I understood why. I spent that night reading and rereading the journals, trying to extract every piece of useful information. Patterns emerged. The entity was most active during winter months. It focused on individuals who were already traumatized or grieving. It couldn't cross certain boundaries, running water, the cabin threshold, perhaps others, without permission. The rules were essentially a codification of those boundaries, teaching rangers how to avoid granting permission inadvertently. But there was one detail that appeared in multiple journals mentioned in passing, never fully explained: the binding ceremony. Haskell had referenced it. So had a 1953 ranger. The Shoshone elder had performed it, creating rules that allowed for coexistence rather than constant predation. What was it? Could it be repeated? Could it be strengthened? At 3 a.m., exhausted but too wired to sleep, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Chris's voice. My partner from Denver, the one who died in my arms while I tried and failed to stop his femoral artery from emptying his life onto the pavement. His voice, coming from just outside the cabin door. Allison? Allison, I'm so cold. Please, you have to help me. I'm hurt. It's so dark out here. Please. I closed the journals with shaking hands and sat perfectly still. Rule number 13 echoing in my mind. After the first snowfall, do not answer the door after dark. It had snowed 3 days ago, the first real accumulation of winter. Allison, please, I know you can hear me. You left me before. Don't leave me again. The voice was perfect. The inflection, the slight drawl he'd developed after growing up in Texas. The way he always said my name with a subtle emphasis on the second syllable. If I closed my eyes, I could see him standing there, tall, lean, always moving with kinetic energy even when trying to stand still. But Chris had died on March 14th. I'd performed CPR even after I knew it was useless, continuing compressions until the other EMTs physically pulled me away. I'd watched his body bag being loaded into the coroner's van. Chris was dead. Whatever stood outside my door speaking with his voice wasn't him. You promised you'd always have my back, the voice continued, taking on a wounded tone. You promised we'd always be there for each other. Was that a lie, Allison? Did you mean it, or was it just something you said? I wanted to scream at it, to tell it that Chris would never manipulate me like that the real Chris had understood triage, had known that some situations had no good choices. But responding would be acknowledging its presence, granting it reality. Instead, I opened Sarah Vance's journal and forced myself to read her words again. You will hear what you need. The entity is patient and it learns quickly. Your only advantage is knowing it's a lie. Chris's voice continued for 2 hours, cycling through pleading, anger, and finally a terrible, broken sadness that nearly shattered my resolve. When dawn finally broke, the voice stopped mid-sentence, cutting off as abruptly as the crying child had weeks ago. I waited an hour after sunrise before opening the door. Footprints in the snow. The same narrow, pointed impressions I'd seen before, leading from the forest to my door and back again. But these tracks had been joined by others, human-looking prints, wearing boots that matched the style Chris had preferred. The tracks overlapped, sometimes the pointed ones, sometimes the human ones, as if whatever made them could switch between forms at will. I followed them to the river's edge, where they vanished into the current. On the opposite bank, I saw a figure standing motionless in the trees, tall, wearing a Park Service uniform from the 1940s based on the style. Ranger William Haskell, perhaps, or one of the others who'd been taken over the decades. The figure raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a warning. Then it turned and walked deeper into the forest, disappearing into the lodgepole pines. I returned to the cabin, locked the door, and began copying the rules from the protocols document by hand, adding notes and observations from the journals. I was building my own map, my own survival guide, because I understood now that this wasn't about courage or strength or even survival skills. It was about discipline, about choosing truth over comfort, reality over fantasy, loneliness over the lies that promised to end it. And I had 73 days remaining until my relief arrived. 73 days to maintain that discipline. 73 days to resist accepting what the entity offered. I wasn't sure I was strong enough, but I was going to try. The first major snowfall came on November 6th, transforming the valley overnight. I woke to silence so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums, the peculiar quiet that comes when fresh snow blankets everything, absorbing sound. The world beyond my windows had become monochrome, white ground, dark trees, gray sky pressing down like a lid. I was now completely isolated. The trails I'd been maintaining were impassable without snowshoes, and even then, travel would be slow and dangerous. Helicopter extraction would be impossible until the weather cleared, which could take days or weeks depending on conditions. The satellite phone still worked for emergencies, but the sense of being cut off from help was absolute. I'd prepared for this. Everyone who worked winter assignments understood that November through March meant true isolation. But understanding it intellectually was different from experiencing it physically. From watching the snow pile up and knowing you were alone in a way few people in the modern world ever experienced. The entity seemed to know it too. That night, the manifestations intensified. I heard voices from multiple people I'd lost. Not just Chris, but the victims from Denver I hadn't been able to save. The child I'd triaged as red but who died before transport arrived. The elderly woman I'd spent 30 minutes trying to resuscitate despite knowing it was hopeless. They called to me from different directions, their voices overlapping, creating a chorus of guilt and grief that made me want to scream. I sat in the cabin with my hands pressed over my ears, the journals spread around me, Sarah Vance's words like a mantra. Your only advantage is knowing it's a lie. The voices continued until dawn. On the second day after the snowfall, I saw movement from the window, a figure on horseback approaching from the south. My first thought was relief, rescue, human contact, someone to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But as the figure drew closer, wariness replaced relief. The horse was laboring through snow up to its chest, moving with the exhausted determination of an animal pushed beyond reasonable limits. The rider was bundled in winter gear, but something about his posture suggested age and weariness. He stopped approximately 50 yards from the cabin, at the tree line I noted, not in the open meadow, and waited. I grabbed my radio and binoculars, studying him. He made no move to approach further, just sat his horse patiently as if content to wait all day. After 20 minutes, I pulled on my coat and boots and went outside, my radio in one pocket, bear spray in the other. As I approached, the man held up one hand in a stopping gesture. "That's close enough," he called. His voice was rough, accented with the cadence I associated with indigenous elders. "I'm not coming nearer to that cabin, and I'd advise you not to invite me." I stopped 30 feet away, confused. "Who are you?" "Vernon Two Bears. My grandfather was medicine man for the mountain Shoshone before the Park Service pushed us off this land." He studied me with eyes that had seen too much. "You're the one currently assigned to the death cabin." "Death cabin? That's what my people call it. Has been for 5 generations since your government built that structure on top of a thin place without asking permission or performing proper ceremonies." He shifted in his saddle, his horse stamping nervously. "I come every few years when someone's stationed here for winter. Most years I'm too late. Rangers already gone one way or another. You're still here, still sane by the look of it. That's good. Why are you here?" "To tell you what I can. What my grandfather told me, what his grandfather told him." Vernon's expression was grim. "The entity you're dealing with, my people don't have a word for it in English. Closest translation is the lonely one or the space between. It's old. Older than the hot springs, older than the mountains. When the world was made, there were cracks left in creation, places where the boundary between life and death here and elsewhere is thin as paper. This valley is one of those places. The journals mentioned a binding ceremony. My grandfather performed the last one, 1919, after 3 rangers vanished in a single winter. The entity can't be destroyed or banished. It's part of the land itself, part of the cracks in reality, but it can be negotiated with, bounded by rules. The ceremony created an agreement. It could exist here, could test those who came, but only within certain limitations. That's what your protocols are. The terms of that agreement. I moved closer despite his earlier warning. Can the ceremony be performed again? Strengthened? Vernon shook his head. Would require 3 medicine men, specific materials, and 7 days of preparation. We don't have the knowledge anymore, not complete. The Park Service broke too many things when they claimed this land, interrupted too many traditions. What's left is maintenance, not creation. The rules as they exist are all you have. Then why come here? Why risk it? Because I'm old and my time's nearly done and I don't want your death on my conscience. He pulled something from his coat, a bundle wrapped in leather. Sage and obsidian, the sage for cleansing, the obsidian for grounding, won't protect you, but they'll help you stay rooted in this reality when the entity tries to pull you elsewhere. He tossed the bundle and I caught it awkwardly. The entity feeds on isolation, he continued. Loneliness is like blood and water to a shark. It can sense it, it's drawn to it, it uses it. Winter makes everyone weak, everyone desperate for connection. That's when it's strongest. It will show you what you've lost, what you need, what you'd give anything to have back. The lie it offers will be perfect because it's reading your mind, your memories, your heart. How do I resist? Remember one thing. The dead are at peace. They're not calling out in pain or need. That's just the living projecting their own grief. Only the living are desperate enough to cry out in darkness. Whatever calls to you from the forest and whatever begs for help or promises reunion. It's not the person you lost. It's something wearing their shape like a costume, and the person you loved wouldn't want you to fall for that trick. Vernon gathered his reins. You're stronger than most I've talked to. You might survive this, but understand, surviving doesn't mean unscathed. This place leaves marks. The rangers who make it out are never quite the same. They've seen behind the curtain, learned that reality has thin spots, that some old stories are just poorly documented truths. Wait, the rangers who vanished, where are they? Are they dead? His expression grew darker. That depends on your definition of dead. The place between isn't life and isn't death. It's existence without being, awareness without substance. My grandfather said those taken by the entity become part of it, absorbed into that space between worlds. Not quite ghosts, not quite alive, just persistent, aware and suffering in ways we can't understand. Can they be brought back? No. Once taken, they're beyond retrieval. That's why the rules exist. Not to fight the entity, but to prevent it from claiming you. He turned his horse. 3 months you've got left. The worst months, the darkest ones, when night lasts 18 hours and cold drives deep into your bones. It will wear you down, wear away your certainty until the lies start seeming reasonable. When that happens, when you're standing at the door, hand on the latch, thinking maybe just this once, remember this conversation. Remember that I rode 2 days through snow to warn you because I've seen too many people taken by that thing. He urged his horse forward, not waiting for a response. I watched him disappear into the trees, his tracks the only evidence he'd been real and not another manifestation. Back in the cabin, I unwrapped the bundle he'd given me. The sage was fresh despite the season, bundled with cord that looked hand-twisted. The obsidian was a single piece, roughly the size of my palm, polished smooth on one side but raw and jagged on the other. a reminder that things could be two states simultaneously, refined and dangerous, safe and sharp. I placed it on the windowsill facing north toward the forest where the entity seemed strongest. Then I burned some of the sage, letting the smoke fill the cabin, and tried to believe it would make a difference. That night I heard a sound that hadn't appeared before, singing. A woman's voice, clear and beautiful, singing a lullaby my mother had sung to me as a child. My mother had been dead for 6 years, lost to cancer that had taken her piece by piece until nothing remained but pain and morphine fog. The song was perfect. Every note, every phrase, exactly as I remembered it. I sat at the table with my hands clenched around the obsidian, feeling its edges bite into my palm, using the pain to ground myself in physical reality. The singing continued for hours, patient and loving. The voice of the person who'd taught me what unconditional love meant. When dawn finally came, I had marks on my palm where the obsidian had broken skin. But I hadn't opened the door. I'd chosen pain over comfort, reality over fantasy. And I understood with cold clarity that this was only the beginning. Winter had arrived, and the entity was just getting started. November deepened into a cold that felt malicious. Temperatures dropping to 20 below zero. The kind of cold that made breathing painful and turned exposed skin numb in minutes. The days contracted to brief periods of twilight, the sun barely cresting the southern peaks before sliding away again. Darkness dominated, and in that darkness the entity found its strength. The nightly manifestations became routine, almost ritualized. Voices called from the forest, Chris most frequently, but also my mother, the Denver victims, even Kyle Morrison's voice begging me to help him escape from beneath the cabin. I learned to identify the tells, the mechanical precision of their speech patterns, the way they never quite responded naturally to unexpected stimuli, the subtle wrongness that marked them as imitations rather than memories. But identifying them didn't make them easier to resist. The isolation was eroding me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd thought I wanted solitude, but there's a difference between chosen privacy and enforced isolation. My radio checks with Whitlock became the highlights of my day. 3 minutes of human contact, carefully scripted, insufficient. I found myself talking to myself constantly, narrating my actions just to hear a voice I could trust. The journals had warned me this would happen. Sarah Vance had documented her own deterioration, noting how loneliness created a vulnerability the entity exploited mercilessly. Vernon's warning echoed constantly. Winter makes everyone weak, everyone desperate for connection. On my 42nd night at Thoroughfare Station, the entity changed tactics. I'd grown accustomed to the voices outside, had developed a mental distance that allowed me to hear them without fully engaging. But that night, the manifestation came with a specificity that shattered my defenses. I heard the sound of the Denver incident. Not voices, the actual audio signature of that day. The screech of tires, the percussion of impact, the immediate aftermath of screaming and car alarms, and that terrible, terrible silence that falls when people's brains are processing trauma too large to immediately comprehend. I heard dispatch calling for all available units, heard my own voice responding, heard Chris confirming our ETA. Then I heard the sounds of triage, victims calling for help, some calmly, some hysterically. The wet sounds of severe trauma, the medical terminology I'd used to categorize injuries, the impossible decisions being made in real time. Red tags for immediate transport, yellow for urgent but stable, green for walking wounded, black for unsalvageable. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sounds continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Then individual voices emerged from the chaos. Please, I have children, please help me. The woman I'd tagged black because her injuries were incompatible with life. because the 3 minutes I could have spent with her needed to go to someone with a chance. She'd been conscious and aware when I made that decision, had understood what the black tag meant. I'm scared. I don't want to die alone. The teenager I'd triaged read, but who died during transport because the ambulance couldn't arrive fast enough, because we didn't have enough hands, because there were too many and too few of us. Why didn't you help me? The elderly man I'd tried to resuscitate for 30 minutes despite knowing it was hopeless, because stopping meant admitting defeat, meant acknowledging I couldn't save everyone. But the worst, the one that finally broke through my defenses, was Chris. Allison, I'm hurt. I'm so cold. Please, you have to help me. You left me before. Don't leave me again. Not his voice from the manifestations I'd grown accustomed to. His actual voice from that day, from the exact moment when he'd been hit by a secondary collision while setting up the perimeter. I'd been 200 yards away working on a victim with a punctured lung. I'd heard the impact. I'd made the decision to finish the procedure before running to him because the woman in front of me would die if I stopped. By the time I reached Chris, his femoral artery was severed and he was going into shock. I'd applied pressure, called for immediate transport, done everything right. But the ambulance was delayed, traffic couldn't clear fast enough, and Chris had bled out while looking at me with eyes that said he understood but were still afraid. Now I heard his voice. Not from the forest, but from just outside the cabin door, speaking with the precise tone and phrasing he'd used in those final moments. I know you did your best. I know it wasn't your fault. But I'm still here, Allison. I'm still hurt. I'm so cold. Please let me in. Please help me. You can save me this time. You can make it right. My hand was on the door latch before I consciously decided to move. Every instinct from my EMT training, every moral conviction I'd built my identity around, every promise I'd made to never abandon someone who needed help. All of it was screaming at me to open the door, to help, to save him this time, to make up for the failure I couldn't forgive myself for. The latch was cold under my fingers. I could feel it starting to lift. Rule number 13, after the first snowfall, do not answer the door after dark. But this was different. This was Chris. This was the partner I'd failed, the friend I'd watched die. The person whose blood had stained my hands while I compressed a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. If there was even a chance. Through the window beside the door, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection. And behind my reflection, visible only in the glass, something crouched in the rafters of the cabin. Massive, angular, its form impossible to fully process, like looking at a three-dimensional object compressed into 2 dimensions, all wrong angles and too many joints. It hung there watching, waiting, its attention focused on me with predatory patience. The window showed the truth the cabin itself obscured. The entity wasn't outside. It had been inside for weeks, waiting in spaces between perception, growing stronger with each manifestation, each moment of doubt, each time I almost gave in. The cabin wasn't shelter. It was a trap I'd locked myself inside, and the entity had been sharing it with me, learning my rhythms, studying my breaking points, waiting for the precise moment when emotional exhaustion would override rational thought. I yanked my hand back from the latch and stumbled away from the door. Chris's voice continued, now taking on an edge of frustration. Allison, what are you doing? I need help. You promised you'd always have my back. Open the door. Open it now. The command in his voice was wrong. Chris had never spoken to me that way, had never demanded or ordered. This was the entity wearing his shape, and its patience was wearing thin. I grabbed the obsidian from the windowsill and held it so tightly the edges cut into my palm again. The pain helped, anchoring me. You're not Chris, I said aloud, my voice shaking. Chris is dead. Chris is at peace. You're just wearing his voice. The thing in the rafters, visible now even without the mirror as if my recognition had given it permission to be seen, shifted position. Its movements were fluid but wrong, like watching film played at the incorrect speed. "You killed him." Not Chris's voice anymore. Something else. Something flat and emotionless. "You chose to save someone else. You left him bleeding while you worked on a stranger. He died calling your name and you weren't there. You were saving someone who mattered less." "That's not," I started, then stopped. Because it was true, technically. I had made that choice. Triage required impossible decisions, required playing God with seconds and probabilities. I'd chosen correctly by protocol. The woman I'd been treating had survivable injuries, and protocol said you finish critical interventions before moving to new patients. But Chris had still died. "You want absolution," the entity continued, its voice now a chorus of all the dead I'd failed to save. "You want someone to tell you it wasn't your fault, that you made the right choice, that you're not responsible, but you are responsible. Every person you tagged black, every patient you couldn't save, every choice you made, you carry them all. That guilt is eating you alive." It moved down from the rafters with impossible grace, becoming more defined, more real with each word. I could see faces in its form now, not clearly but suggestions of features, ghostly impressions of the dead shifting across its surface like water. "I can end it," the entity said. "I can take that guilt away. I can reunite you with everyone you've lost. All you have to do is accept, say yes. Open the door, step outside, join them in the place between where no one suffers, where no one has to make impossible choices, where no one dies alone." It was offering me exactly what I wanted, an end to grief, to guilt, to the crushing weight of survival when others hadn't. The place between sounded like mercy, like rest, like the peace I hadn't known since Denver. My hand drifted toward the door again. Then I remembered Vernon's words. The dead are at peace. They're not calling out in pain or need. That's just the living projecting their own grief. Chris wasn't in pain. Chris wasn't suffering. Chris was dead, which meant he was beyond pain, beyond need, beyond anything except memory. This entity was offering me comfort built on a lie. It was promising reunion with people who didn't exist anymore, at least not in any form that would know or care about reunion. The place between wasn't mercy. It was obliteration dressed up as salvation. I turned away from the door to face the entity directly. It had descended completely now, standing in the center of the cabin wearing a form that hurt to look at directly. Too many angles, too much depth, presence, without proper substance. "I choose the pain," I said, and my voice barely shook. "I choose to remember them. I choose the guilt because it means they were real, that they mattered, that their deaths meant something. You're offering me oblivion disguised as reunion, and I won't accept it." The entity tilted its impossible head. "You'll break eventually, everyone does. Winter is long and you're so very alone." "Maybe," I admitted, "but not tonight." I lit Vernon's sage, filling the cabin with smoke, and spoke the words he'd taught me. Shoshone phrases I didn't fully understand, but that carried weight, intention, refusal. The entity didn't flee or dissolve. It simply stepped back, retreating to the edges of the cabin, to the spaces between walls and floor, to the corners where shadows gathered even in direct light. Not defeated, not banished, just denied. "Until next time," it said, and its voice carried absolute certainty. Then it was gone, or at least invisible again, and I was alone in the cabin with the smoke and the silence and the knowledge that I'd passed a test, but that the examination was far from over. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the table, obsidian in one hand, sage burning in a bowl before me, staring at the door I'd almost opened. Vernon had been right. Surviving didn't mean unscathed. I could feel the damage already, cracks in my certainty, questions about how many more nights like this I could endure. The entity had learned my breaking point. It knew exactly what lie would be most convincing. And it had 73 more days to wear me down. The month that followed my confrontation with the entity was a study in psychological warfare. The nightly manifestations continued, but with a new sophistication, as if my resistance had forced it to evolve. The voices no longer pleaded or commanded. They conversed, they reasoned, they presented arguments for why accepting its offer would be the rational, merciful, right choice. I heard my own voice most frequently now, speaking from corners of the cabin I wasn't occupying, having one-sided conversations that sounded like my internal monologue made external. It knew my thoughts, my doubts, my moment-by-moment state of mind. The boundary between my consciousness and its presence had become permeable. I stopped sleeping in the bed. Instead, I dozed in a chair at the table, obsidian always in hand, sage burning constantly, my mind hovering in a state between wakefulness and exhaustion that left me functional but deteriorating. I lost weight despite adequate food. My hands developed a tremor. I caught myself talking to empty rooms and couldn't always remember if I'd initiated the conversation or was responding to the entity. The journals had documented this phase. William Haskell's entries from his final week showed similar degradation. Sarah Vance had described it as dissolution of the boundary between self and other. The entity wasn't trying to break me through fear anymore. It was trying to merge with me, to blur the distinction between its thoughts and mine until accepting its offer seemed like my own idea. On December 15th, my solar panels failed. Not weather damage, they simply stopped functioning. All 4 panels simultaneously, despite clear skies and adequate sunlight. My battery reserves dropped to critical levels within hours. I radioed Whitlock, but atmospheric conditions had turned bad, creating interference that reduced communication to fragments of distorted sound. A supply helicopter couldn't reach me for at least a week, maybe longer if the weather worsened. I had 3 days of battery power remaining, maybe 4 if I rationed carefully. Then darkness. Complete darkness in the depths of an Alaskan winter with the entity waiting. I spent the first day conducting emergency repairs, trying everything I could think of to restore power. Nothing worked. The panels were physically intact but electrically dead, as if something had drained them of their fundamental capacity to convert light to energy. By evening, I'd exhausted every option. My radio had enough battery for 1 more transmission. I used it to file a final report, keeping my voice steady despite the fear. Bristow Ridge to District, this is my last transmission until power restoration. Solar array non-functional, cause unknown. Battery reserves critical. If I don't check in within 7 days, assume emergency situation. Whitlock's response was garbled, but I caught the essential words. Helicopter, weather, 5 days, hold position. 5 days, 120 hours. And I had maybe 48 hours of battery power remaining. The entity knew. I could feel its attention sharpening, focusing, preparing for the final push. That night, the cabin's lights failed. Not gradually. They simply cut out, mid-evening, dropping me into absolute darkness, broken only by the dim glow of emergency lighting that would last perhaps 2 hours more. I grabbed my flashlight, but its beam seemed pathetically small against the weight of darkness pressing in. And in that darkness, the entity manifested completely. Not as separate presence, but as environmental condition, as if the darkness itself was the entity's true form, and everything else had been projections, fingers of a much larger hand. The cabin grew cold despite the wood stove burning. Frost began forming on the interior walls, impossible given the temperature, spreading in patterns that almost looked like writing, like messages in a language I couldn't quite read. The voices came from everywhere simultaneously, no longer pretending to be outside. They filled the cabin, overlapping and echoing. "Chris, you could have saved me." My mother, "I'm so disappointed in you." The Denver victims, "You killed us, you chose wrong." Kyle Morrison, "You let me crawl into that space, you didn't stop me." And beneath them all, the entity's true voice, not words but intention, pure meaning bypassing language entirely. "End this. Accept, join us, rest, peace, mercy, release." The promises washed over me like physical force, and I felt my resistance crumbling. Every hour I'd slept poorly, every meal I'd eaten without tasting, every moment of isolation and fear, it all accumulated into exhaustion so profound that surrender seemed not just reasonable but inevitable. Why was I fighting? To prove something? To whom? Everyone I'd cared about was dead or distant. My career was over. No one returned from assignments like this unchanged, functional. If I survived until extraction, I'd spend months in psychological evaluation, would likely never work as an EMT again, would carry these memories for whatever remained of my life. The entity was offering an alternative. Cessation. Not death exactly, but an ending. A release from the burden of consciousness and guilt and memory. My hand found the door latch. The entity showed me a vision. The place between. Not a location, but a state. Existence without pain, without choice, without the weight of consequence. I saw the others there, the Rangers taken over decades, William Haskell and the disappeared soldiers, and Kyle Morrison and countless others. They weren't suffering. They weren't anything. They simply were, suspended in a gray space between states, aware but unburdened, present but not conscious in the way that creates pain. It looked like mercy. My fingers closed around the latch and I felt it begin to lift. Then in the darkness, my flashlight beam caught something I'd missed in my deterioration. The journals still spread across the table where I'd been studying them. Sarah Vance's final entry was visible, her handwriting steady despite her documented desperation. "Your only advantage is knowing it's a lie." The words cut through the fog of exhaustion and despair. I stood there, hand on the latch, and forced myself to think clearly through the haze. The entity promised an end to suffering. But suffering was part of being alive, part of being human. The alternative wasn't peace, it was absence. The place between wasn't a destination, it was negation, erasure, the dissolution of everything that made identity meaningful. Chris was dead. My mother was dead. The Denver victims were dead. They weren't in the place between, they were simply gone, returned to whatever state preceded consciousness. Only I was suffering, only I was carrying the weight of survival. Because I was still alive. And being alive meant pain sometimes. Meant guilt sometimes. Meant making impossible choices and living with the consequences. The entity wasn't offering salvation, it was offering surrender disguised as mercy, oblivion dressed up as reunion. Vernon had said the dead were at peace because they were beyond need, beyond awareness, beyond everything except memory in the minds of the living. What called to me from the darkness wasn't them. It was something wearing their shapes, parasitizing my grief to feed itself. "No," I said aloud and released the latch. The entity's response was immediate and violent. The cabin's temperature plummeted, frost spreading faster, and the voices became screams, not of pain but of frustration, of rage, of a predator denied its prey at the final moment. The manifestations became visible even in the dying emergency lights. Faces in the frost, hands reaching from the walls, impossible geometries warping the corners of the room. The entity had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. Something ancient and hungry that had learned to weaponize human loneliness. I grabbed Vernon's sage, lit the last bundle, and spoke the words he'd taught me, shouting them over the cacophony of voices. The Shoshone phrases carried weight beyond their literal meaning. Centuries of negotiation and boundary setting. The binding ceremony's remnants passed down through generations. The entity didn't retreat. Instead, it showed me the alternative to acceptance. Decades more of life carrying this trauma, this knowledge of thin places and the things that dwell in them. It showed me walking through crowds and seeing Kyle Morrison's face, sitting in quiet rooms and hearing Chris's voice, living with the awareness that reality had cracks and something immense moved in the spaces between. It showed me what survival would cost. I accept that, I said and meant it. I choose to remember. I choose to carry the weight. I choose pain over oblivion. The entity screamed, a sound like tearing reality, like the fabric of physical law being stressed past tolerance. Then it withdrew. Not defeated, I understood, but simply denied again. I'd passed its final test, refused its best offer, chosen life even knowing what life would include. The voices stopped. The cold receded. The frost on the walls began to melt. And in the sudden silence I heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. The helicopter arrived at dawn on December 17th, 3 days earlier than scheduled, fighting weather that made the landing dangerous. Later, Whitlock would tell me they'd mobilized emergency extraction after my final radio transmission, had pushed through marginal conditions because something in my voice had concerned him. I didn't remember sounding concerned. I'd thought I'd maintained professional composure. But apparently, 2 months of isolation and psychological siege had left marks in my voice that were audible even through radio static. The ranger who came with the helicopter, a woman named Torres I'd never met, took one look at me and immediately called for medical evaluation. I'd lost 23 pounds. My hands shook constantly. My hair had developed streaks of premature gray at the temples. Most concerning, apparently, was my affect. Flat, dissociated, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much. Torres conducted a brief assessment, then began packing my essentials without asking if I wanted to leave. The decision had already been made. I was being extracted whether I agreed or not. Whitlock's voice came through her radio, professionally concerned. "Porter, you've done your tour. Time to come home." I wanted to argue, wanted to prove I could finish my assignment. But looking at Torres's worried face, seeing my own reflection in the cabin window, gaunt, aged, barely recognizable, I understood that survival had required everything I had. There was nothing left for pride or stubborn completion. I gathered the journals, wrapped them carefully in waterproof material, and carried them to the helicopter. If I couldn't finish my tour, I could at least ensure the next ranger had access to the accumulated wisdom of everyone who'd faced the entity. As we lifted off, I looked down at the thoroughfare cabin, small and isolated in its valley of snow. From the air, it looked innocent, picturesque even, a rustic outpost in pristine wilderness. Nothing in its appearance suggested the hunger that dwelt in the space beneath its floors, in the thin places where reality frayed. At the tree line, I saw figures, 7 of them standing motionless, watching the helicopter depart. Even from altitude, I recognized some. Kyle Morrison, William Haskell in his antique uniform. Others I didn't know, rangers taken before my time, absorbed into the place between. They didn't wave, they simply watched. Witnesses to another survivor, another person who'd resisted but would never be free of what they'd experienced. Torres followed my gaze. "Do you see something down there?" I almost lied. Then I realized there was no point. "Ghosts," I said. "Or something like them." She didn't press for details, and I was grateful for that small mercy. The flight to park headquarters took 90 minutes, and I spent them staring at nothing, feeling the distance grow between me and the cabin, but knowing that distance was mostly illusory. What I'd experienced hadn't stayed in that valley. I'd brought it with me, internalized it, made it part of my worldview. The psychological evaluation took 3 days. I answered honestly, described what I'd seen and heard, submitted the journals as evidence. The counselor, a man with kind eyes and 2 decades of experience with wilderness trauma, listened without judgment, asked clarifying questions, took careful notes. His final assessment was carefully worded. Acute stress reaction combined with isolation-induced psychological phenomena. Ms. Porter's symptoms are consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme isolation and cumulative trauma. Recommend immediate leave, continued counseling, and postponement of any remote assignments pending full recovery. The report didn't call me crazy. It didn't acknowledge the entity or validate my experience. It simply documented that something had happened, had left measurable impact and required treatment. I took medical leave and returned to Denver, the place I'd fled 8 months earlier. The city felt overwhelming after months of solitude. Too many people, too much noise, the constant assault of sensory input. I moved through crowds like a ghost, hyper-aware of everyone around me, constantly scanning for threats that wouldn't appear here. But they did appear, not physically but in perception's corners. I'd be walking down a street and catch a glimpse of Kyle Morrison's face in the crowd, gone when I looked directly. I'd be in my apartment at night and hear Chris's voice from empty rooms calling my name with that same pleading tone. The entity hadn't followed me, I understood that much. But it had marked me, changed the way I perceived reality, opened awareness of the thin places that existed everywhere. Vernon Two Bears had warned me. The wilderness is everywhere, Allison. In city parks, in loneliness, in the spaces between people. The thin places weren't confined to remote valleys. They existed anywhere. Isolation and desperation created conditions the entity could exploit. In the solitude of grief, in the gaps between human connection, in the moments when loneliness made you vulnerable to lies about reunion and release. I kept sage burning in every room of my apartment. I never slept in complete darkness. I avoided mirrors when tired because sometimes in the reflection I'd see things that weren't in the room. Shadows that moved wrong. Figures standing where no one stood. Reminders that I'd glimpsed behind reality's curtain and couldn't unsee what I'd learned. My counselor helped to a degree. I learned techniques for grounding myself in present reality, for distinguishing perception from hallucination, for managing the hypervigilance that had become my default state. But she couldn't undo the fundamental change in my understanding of the world. I knew things now that couldn't be unknown, had experienced things that couldn't be rationalized away. I tried returning to EMT work after 2 months of leave, lasted 3 shifts before realizing I couldn't do it anymore. Not because I'd lost my skills, those were intact, but because every patient reminded me of triage, of impossible choices, of the guilt the entity had weaponized so effectively. I couldn't separate present reality from past trauma. Couldn't treat patients without seeing the Denver victims in their faces. I resigned and found work as a medical supply dispatcher, something with regular hours and no direct patient contact. It was bearable, if deeply unsatisfying. My life had narrowed to simple survival, work, therapy, careful management of symptoms, avoidance of triggers. 3 months after leaving Thoroughfare, I received a letter postmarked from Montana, no return address. Inside was a single page in Vernon Two Bears' handwriting. You won. But it remembers you now, and it's patient. The wilderness is everywhere, Allison, in city parks, in loneliness, in the spaces between people. The cabin was just where it's strongest. Out here, it can only whisper. Try not to listen. The journals you brought out have been copied and returned to the station. The next ranger will have them. You did more than survive. You added to the record, helped the next person. That matters. Remember that when the nights are difficult, you saved the next one even if you couldn't save yourself. I kept the letter, reading it when the manifestations were particularly strong, when I'd wake at 3 a.m. convinced I'd heard Chris's voice from the kitchen, when the loneliness felt like it might consume me entirely. Vernon was right. I'd won. I'd survived. I'd resisted the entity's best efforts to take me. But survival came with a price. The rangers who made it out of places like Thoroughfare Station were never quite the same. We'd seen reality's thin places, learned that old myths were poorly documented truths, understood that loneliness and desperation could open doors that should remain closed. We carried that knowledge like a burden, aware that the entity was patient, that it could afford to wait, that every moment of isolation or grief or desperate loneliness was an opportunity for it to whisper its lies again. I survived, but I'd never be free. 6 months after my extraction from Thoroughfare Station, the Park Service issued a posting for the next winter assignment. I learned about it through the internal newsletter I still received despite my resignation, a brief paragraph noting that the position was available, qualifications required, application deadline approaching. I stared at that paragraph for a long time, remembering the cabin, the cold, the entity's patient hunger. Remembering Kyle Morrison disappearing into the crawlspace. Remembering the figures at the tree line, watching the helicopter depart, bearing witness to another ranger who'd survived but been permanently changed. I wondered who would apply. Who would read the protocols and dismiss them as folklore? Who would be desperate enough or isolated enough or damaged enough to request assignment to a place that broke people by design? The answer came 4 weeks later in another entry in the newsletter. Emma Chen had been assigned to Thoroughfare Station beginning September 30th. I looked her up in the Park Service directory, 26 years old, previously stationed at a visitor center in Yosemite, requesting remote assignment after a difficult divorce. The personnel notes mentioned she'd specifically asked for the most isolated posting available, wanted time alone to process and heal. I recognized the request. It was almost identical to what I'd asked for, motivated by the same need for distance and silence, the same belief that isolation would provide clarity. I tried to contact her. Sent emails explaining what she'd be facing, what the protocols really meant, why following them was critical. The emails bounced back. Chen hadn't set up her Park Service account yet, was still in transition between postings. I called Whitlock, asked if he could arrange a meeting or at least ensure Chen received proper briefing. He was professional but distant, his tone suggesting I was overstepping. Ms. Porter, I appreciate your concern, but Ms. Chen has received all standard orientation materials, including the station protocols. She's a qualified ranger. I'm confident she'll be fine. Tom, please just make sure she reads the rules. All of them. Make sure she understands they're not folklore. A pause. Allison, you've been through trauma, I understand that, but not every ranger has the same experience. Chen will be fine. He didn't believe me. Or more accurately, he believed the official assessment. Acute stress reaction. Isolation-induced psychological phenomena. Symptoms consistent with trauma, but not with objective supernatural threat. I hung up feeling helpless and angry. The helicopter delivered Emma Chen to Thoroughfare Station on September 30th, right on schedule. I knew because I'd been monitoring the Park Service dispatches obsessively, tracking her arrival like I could somehow protect her through sheer attention. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment, sage burning as always, and thought about Chen alone in that cabin. Was she reading the protocols? Dismissing them? Had she found the journals, or had someone removed them, deciding they reflected poorly on the Park Service's management? At 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and opened my laptop. The thoroughfare station had a webcam installed for weather monitoring that uploaded periodic snapshots to a public server. The images were low resolution, updated only every 6 hours, but they showed the cabin and immediate surroundings. I pulled up the most recent image, time-stamped 02:00 that morning. The cabin looked normal, lights on, smoke from the chimney, snow beginning to accumulate from an early season storm. But at the tree line, if I looked carefully, I could make out shapes. 7 figures standing motionless, barely distinguishable from the trees, watching the cabin with patient attention. Waiting. The entity would already be testing her, I knew. Small things at first, unexplained sounds, fleeting movements at the edge of vision, the feeling of being watched. Chen would rationalize them, would tell herself it was wildlife or wind or the adjustment to isolation. Then the manifestations would escalate. Someone from her past would call from the forest. Something would move beneath the cabin. The entity would study her, learn her vulnerabilities, identify exactly what lie would be most convincing. And Chen would have to decide moment by moment whether to follow rules that seemed like superstition or trust her own judgment, her own needs, her own desperate desire for the comfort the entity promised. I pulled up the protocols document, the one Whitlock had sent me 9 months earlier, and began writing annotations. Detailed notes about each rule, why it existed, what happened when it was broken, the consequences I'd witnessed or read about in the journals. I was creating a companion guide, a decoder for the protocols that would make their importance undeniable. When I finished, I emailed it to Chen, to Whitlock, to the Park Service's regional office. Marked it urgent, required reading, critical safety information. The responses came the next day. Automated acknowledgments, no indication anyone had actually read the document. Chen's email bounced again. She still hadn't activated her account, was presumably too busy settling in to bother with administrative tasks. I tried one more avenue. I called Vernon Two Bears. The number took hours to track down, required calling 3 different tribal offices and explaining my connection to Thoroughfare. When I finally reached him, his voice sounded older, more tired. "Ms. Porter, I heard you survived your time at the death cabin." "Barely, Vernon. They sent another ranger, Emma Chen. She's there now, alone, and I don't think she understands what she's facing." A long silence. "Did you send her the journals?" "I left them at the station. But I don't know if she's found them, if she's reading them." "Then you've done what you can," Vernon said gently. "The entity will test her. Same as it tested you. Same as it's tested everyone. She'll either follow the rules or she won't. Either resist or accept. The choice is hers. But we could help her. You could ride out there, warn her like you warned me." "I'm 83 years old, Ms. Porter. I made that ride one last time for you. I can't make it again." He paused. "Besides, warnings don't work unless the person is already afraid. You'd been there long enough to understand something was wrong. You were ready to hear what I had to say. This Chen woman, she's still in the skeptical phase. She'd hear my warnings as the ramblings of a superstitious old man. So we just let her face it alone? That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The entity exists because of isolation. It feeds on it, requires it. Trying to protect someone from it means breaking the isolation, which means they'd never be assigned there in the first place." Vernon's voice grew softer. "You survived because you chose to, moment by moment, night after night. If Chen survives, it'll be because she makes the same choice. And if she doesn't, you'll have another companion in your nightmares." I knew he was right, but the helplessness was crushing. "The journals," I said desperately. "At least tell me they're still there, that she has access to them." "They're there. I made sure of it myself. Rode out last month and confirmed. They're in the storage room right where you left them. If she looks, she'll find them." And if she doesn't look? Vernon didn't answer, which was answer enough. We spoke for a few more minutes, Vernon sharing that his health was declining, that he probably wouldn't be able to make the ride to Thoroughfare again even if he wanted to. The knowledge of the thin places, the binding ceremony, the negotiations with the entity. It was dying with his generation, becoming fragmented folklore rather than remembered truth. You should write it down, I said. Everything you know. Create a record. For who? The Park Service doesn't want it. They prefer their explanation. Isolation-induced hallucinations, psychological breaks, tragic but natural incidents. My own people barely believe it anymore. We've been pushed off that land so long the stories have become myths rather than warnings. He sighed. But you're right. I'll write what I can, send it to you. At least someone will have it. I thanked him and we ended the call. That night I pulled up the webcam feed again. The image had updated, now showing the cabin in afternoon light. No smoke from the chimney. Chen was probably out on patrol, getting familiar with her territory, having no idea what waited in the trees. At the forest edge, the figures had moved closer. 9 of them now, I counted. Kyle Morrison had joined the Watchers and another I didn't recognize. The entity's collection growing, patient and eternal. I wondered if Chen could see them yet, or if they were still invisible to her, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I wondered if she'd found the journals, if she was reading the rules with the seriousness they required. I wondered if she'd survive. But mostly I wondered if the entity remembered me as well as Vernon claimed. If somewhere in the thin spaces in the place between my presence was noted, my resistance recorded, my refusal marked as a temporary condition rather than permanent victory. Because Vernon was right about one thing. It was patient. It could afford to wait for me to be alone again, to be desperate again, to be vulnerable in ways I couldn't predict or prevent. The cabin in the webcam image looked peaceful, almost welcoming. But I knew better. I knew what lived beneath its floors, in the spaces between its walls, in the thin places where reality frayed like old fabric. I knew what waited for Emma Chen, learning her fears, studying her grief, preparing the perfect lie that would convince her to open the door. And I knew that no matter how far I ran, how long I stayed in cities and crowds, how carefully I avoided isolation, part of me would always be in that cabin, standing with my hand on the latch, choosing between comfort and truth, between surrender and survival. The entity would remember me, and I would remember it. That was the real legacy of Thoroughfare Station, not the weather data or wildlife records, but the knowledge that some places should remain empty, that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, that some offers should never be accepted no matter how perfect they sound. Emma Chen would learn that if she survived, and if she didn't, she'd become another figure at the tree line, another witness to the next ranger's struggle, another ghost wearing the shape of someone who'd once been real. The cycle continued. The cabin waited, and somewhere in the darkness between here and elsewhere, the entity prepared to welcome another newcomer. Patient as always, hungry as always. Eternal as the cold and the snow and the thin places where reality comes undone.